Welcome to our map. Our map is called Climate Change and Incarceration, investigating wildfire and heat risk on prisons, jails, detention centers, and psychiatric facilities. So our planned or proposed use case scenario is for an environmental justice activist interested in convincing policymakers in their state of Louisiana to take action on the disproportionate climate change impacts on those who are incarcerated. However, this activist may have they spend a lot of time on the computer and have some visual impairments. So we start off on our opening screen with a font size selection. And they cycle through the font sizes and they decide that the regular font is actually what works for them. But since they spend so much time on their computer, they also know that contrast can make a big difference. And so they cycle through the contrast and realize that dark mode is the better contrast theme for them. And so they scroll down and come up with a story on kind of these impacts or disproportionate impacts on people who are incarcerated and heat risk and wildfire risk. They come up with this idea of carceral locales, enclosures like prisons, jails, detention centers, psychiatric facilities that are grouped together because of the disabling impact of mass incarceration in the United States, as well as the pervasive logics of incarceration that characterize the lives of disabled and mad people at psychiatric facilities. And so with this knowledge, they are better prepared to take action on and convince policymakers that all of these people in carceral locales need policy change in relation to climate change impacts. And so they scroll down to interact with the tool to understand more about how incarceration produces vulnerability and disability in Louisiana. So once they're at the map, they're presented with an overview. They see that Louisiana is already at a higher risk of the average number of days above 90 degrees historically, especially compared with the entirety of the United States, but even in comparison to the US South. And so they decide to search for Louisiana, to zoom in and see the different carceral locales across the state. Similar to the statewide overview, most of the carceral locales across the state have historically between 100 and 125 days above 90 degrees. And knowing the policymakers in Louisiana and their responses to climate change, there's not been much work or policy action taken on it. So looking at the possible projection of what will happen if there's no response to climate change, she sees that the case will become much worse across the state for all these carceral locales and people incarcerated in them. And even with rapid climate action, there's a lot of days above 90 degrees, but it's a lot better than no response at all. And so, in order to understand maybe some trends or outliers, she scrolls down and looks to filter by the type of facility to see whether maybe there are some clumps or places that might require some more immediate action. So she cycles through county prisons, state prisons, federal prisons, detention centers, and psychiatric facilities. And while there are a lot of county prisons and psychiatric facilities, she sees that state prisons especially have a lot of people incarcerated in them. For example, she clicks on this large circle here and sees that Louisiana State Penitentiary has over 6,000 people incarcerated in it. And if there is no action taken against climate change, there will be 171 days above 90 degrees. However, she circles back to county prisons, knowing that it might be easier to convince people at the municipal level to take action on this issue, and sees that there are some clusters around Lafayette and New Orleans, but she isn't sure. So she instead of seeing the number of detainees per carceral locale, she looks to see them as points. And her idea of these clusters was true. So she sees New Orleans, Lafayette have these big clusters of carceral locales. So being from New Orleans, she zooms into New Orleans and sees there's a lot of locations here that may be ready for some sort of pilot project that, reduces the heat risk or the heat impact on people who are incarcerated, or pilot some sort of programs that gets people out of these locations altogether. And so she refreshes a page to get back to the overview look and to see how Louisiana is doing in comparison to these other places in the US South. With no response to climate change, Louisiana is in a pretty similar location to others in the US South. But she knows that with rapid response to climate change, there's an opportunity for the situation to be better for those incarcerated in Louisiana. She also notices this wildfire risk filter when she clicks on it. Wildfire risk hasn't historically been a problem in Louisiana, and this map confirms it. The wildfire risk is relatively low, unlike California, where it is very high. But just to make sure that there are no outliers or in the state of Louisiana, she once again zooms into Louisiana. And she sees that in the southwest portion, there's a cluster of carceral locales that may be disproportionately impacted by wildfire. The risk seems to be relatively moderate, but just to see the number of people who are impacted, she switches back to the capacity numbers. And she sees that actually, although there's an increased risk of wildfires in this region, there aren't that many people impacted, and her efforts might be better focused towards the pilot projects around heat risk in the New Orleans region. And with that, we're going to refresh the map and go back to the overview. Thank you.